All right, just a couple more things to do. There's the aftermath of the 2008 crisis up to the present. There were responses to the 2008 crisis. There were more than I'm listing here. There was actually a stimulus where everybody got a check, kind of like what we just saw with COVID-19. A lot of people forgot about that. It was before the financial crisis hit, but we were already seeing signs that it was coming. Then the crisis hit. Lehman Brothers fell. Bear Stearns first, and then Lehman Brothers. Major financial players who had a lot of subprime loans. And after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, it was clear that about a dozen or so other major financial firms were also going to cease to exist. They were going to go away forever. And that would basically mean we don't have an economy anymore, is how it was basically put. So the Paulson bailouts, that's after Hank Paulson, Secretary of the Treasury under George W. Bush. Those, contrary to popular belief, it wasn't just a bunch of cash that was thrown at banks. They were essentially loans with actually a few buy-ups of stock that a lot of banks didn't even want to accept, and they were essentially told, no, you have to take this. And the banks have actually paid back the majority of the money given to them. So the Paulson bailouts actually made the government money. You hear arguments about how we should be able to do this thing that'll cost hundreds of billions because we bailed the banks out. Well, that was a one-time thing, and it was a loan that was paid back. So it's kind of not a correct comparison. So Team Keynes tends to endorse the Paulson bailouts, although they are concerned about moral hazard, which we'll get to in a sec. The ERA stands for the Economic Recovery Act, more colloquially known as the Obama stimulus. It had a lot of stuff in it, and it tried to leverage transfers, spending, and tax cuts. We've seen all three levers. It tried to put all three levers into it. Team Keynes calls them tax cuts. They weren't cuts to marginal rates. They were more incentives that allowed for larger tax rebates for certain people we'll get to who a lot of them were. Dodd-Frank was a regulatory reform of Wall Street. Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, the Senate's authors, were also two of the largest recipients of Wall Street donations. So with both the ERA and Dodd-Frank, a lot of people on Team Keynes, a lot of economists will say things, try to sugarcoat it by saying, well, they were good ideas that were poorly executed. The Bush-era tax cuts expired around 2012. Unemployment was still high. I remember Paul Krugman, one of the leading members on Team Keynes, Nobel Prize-winning economist and author for the New York Times, saying that was a big mistake. For a lot of the same reasons we've already looked at. We've seen how letting taxes go up on anybody is bad for economic recovery. The ACA stands for the Affordable Care Act, again more colloquially known as Obamacare. Jonathan Gruber is the economist from MIT who was one of the main economists consulted on the act. A lot of people on Team Keynes will point out that it didn't really do everything he wanted it to do, and missed opportunity to implement a better system. There are some economists who are like Jonathan Gruber who were trying to get what Germany and Switzerland have as their healthcare systems. Only about 8 countries in the world actually have single payer. Germany and Switzerland are very free market oriented healthcare systems with government interventions in just a couple of areas that help to ensure more access to healthcare for everybody and better payment arrangements and so on, but it's very decentralized, and that's the sort of thing Gruber was trying to institute. Other economists see the missed opportunity as being Medicare for all. That's what the aforementioned Paul Krugman would prefer, a Medicare program that's already established and already has a lot of people on it who are happy with it, that would be funded through additional means so that it could cover everybody. So that's Team Keynes talking about the responses to the 2008 crisis, stuff that was good in theory, a lot of clunky implementation that led to a longer recovery than necessary. Also, financial crises have slow recoveries because you need the financial system to be willing to lend again. Team Hayek says that the Paulson bailouts, Hayek types don't really like the bailouts because although they may have prevented much worse economic collapse. Moral hazard refers to the idea if you get car insurance, then you might drive a little more recklessly. It's something in the insurance biz that basically says once people are insured, they'll behave more recklessly. So if banks believe they can engage in risky activities, the government's just going to bail them out. So why not? Meanwhile, Hayek types will point out that a lot of the money that was given away under the Obama stimulus went to Democratic donors, and Dodd-Frank, it really inhibited investment and was maybe better for big Wall Street firms, not so much for smaller ones. There's agreement on letting the Bush tax cuts expire, where the Hayek types thought they should never expire. Team Keynes thought they should have expired a few years later. One of the big problems with the ACA, according to Hayek types, was that it didn't really address the problems in the healthcare system, having to do largely with the fact that each state issues its own license, and they won't license you, or they won't accept your license from out of state. And it's a very corruptible system that tends to result in just one or two, some cases just one insurance company as the only insurance company in the state. You essentially have artificially created monopolies and oligopolies. There really isn't disagreement about the fact that that exists. Team Hayek types say that that's central to the healthcare issues and wasn't at all addressed by the ACA. That just basically made things work worse by adding extra layers of government onto it, and this also inhibited a lot of economic growth. Then we get to the present, pre-COVID-19. We've already kind of talked about a little bit, and there's a lot that we don't know is going to happen, but economic growth since 2016, Team Keynes says it's been growing since 2010, and full employment was reached years before the present administration. Recessions are going to happen, though, and we're long overdue for one, so it was an unusually long period of recovery. Hayek types say growth just hasn't been good until recently. And low unemployment, we saw how the unemployment rate works. You have a lower labor force participation rate, you can have lower unemployment, but that doesn't mean that things are looking good. Basically, Hayek types will say you can say that the Obama administration set us up for this growth, but we're yet to get any specifics. Which policies, based on what theory, had a sort of delayed effect? It just seems kind of convenient to say it was the person before. Meanwhile, we've seen a lot of deregulating and a lot of tax cuts, which we keep saying they work if you look at the data correctly, and they look like they worked again, according to the Team Hayek types. One more thing to talk about, and that is the inequality issue, which again, I'm not going to give it the time it deserves. It's very multifaceted. But if you have a lot of inequality, rich people are getting richer, you can take more away from them without really hurting them and give it to the poor. Justification for more progressive taxes. You may have heard the problem where there's a fear that if inequality gets too large, the masses will rise up and we'll have violence in the streets. There are also a lot of interesting models that show that more inequality leads to less growth in the long run. If you have credit market imperfections, if you have types of policies that will be favored by people in the face of growing inequality. So Team Keynes types tend to think there are a lot of articles and op-eds and speeches that economists have written saying it's the number one issue of the 21st century facing the economy. Team Hayek types will say it's the number one non-issue of the 21st century. As long as all ships are rising, as they said, it doesn't really matter distribution as long as everybody's doing better, and some people should get paid more than others. The CBO's done a lot of work on inequality. This is the one that I first became aware of in 2011, that there's a common refrain that middle-class incomes have flatlined, and that's maybe technically true when comparing it to the growth in top incomes, but this study and other studies and just eyeballing data on the Fred database show that incomes across the board after adjusting for inflation have risen for everybody. There's also, we usually talk about the incomes that characterize different income, different places in the income spectrum, but we don't look at individual movement over time. People in 1979 who were in the bottom 20% are not the same people who were in the bottom 20% in 2007. Most studies have shown that most people in the bottom 20% in 1979 are in a higher income bracket. Actually, I put the wrong data here. It's a little over 50% who get in the top 20%. It's 90% who are in at least one income above where they were. So I'm going to fix that before I upload these slides to D2L. As far as fears of civil unrest are concerned, it's something that people say are going to happen, but Team Hayek types will say there's no historical precedent for it. Not when poor and middle class people are getting richer, even if they're not getting richer as fast as people at the top. If you're finding your income rising over time, even after adjusting for inflation, you're not as likely to throw it all away and be violent just because you're jealous that somebody's doing better. And as far as those models that predict growing inequality, all models have some flawed assumptions, and you can take them to the data, but they're a data where they don't describe everything perfectly, and it's, again, a matter of opinion. It's just really well-formed mathematical opinion, but credit market imperfections, is it really an imperfection? Are we talking about inequality or just lower incomes? There are a lot of questions, and some of those models, people are going to support policies that reduce growth because of lower inequality. Well, that's not inequality, that's people supporting bad policies. So a lot of this civil unrest or supporting bad policies would be because of people on Team Keynes who are telling people things that aren't necessarily true and guiding people towards bad behavior. So says Team Hayek. So a lot of different arguments among economists, no easy solutions. Come down on whatever side you want. We generally do choose which sides we're on because it's kind of hard to follow any definitive arguments to any of these conclusions, but the debates are rich if you get into them and try to pull back and avoid the tendency we all have to take sides at the outset. They can be some very interesting debates that I encourage you to read more on now that you have a bit more foundational knowledge of how economies work in general. Hopefully, if I've been any good in this class.